everyone, welcome to our next session. So we are who we are, understanding current attitudes. So we're really pleased to be joined by Mike Clemence from Ipsos. Thanks for coming back to communicate, Mike, who's going to be sharing a bit about current public attitudes on the environment. And just before I hand over to Mike, it'd be lovely if you're able to say hello in the chat. I know we've got a big spread of people across the UK, all on our laptops, and further afield, we had a delegate from Portugal join us yesterday. So if you could say hi in the chat and just share perhaps what you can see from your laptop. So perhaps that is out of the window or across the room. So I'm in our conference online headquarters, and not much of a view from the window, but I can see opposite me a rather huge table of snacks to keep the team going. Mike, what can you see from your laptop?
Hi, Ellie, and hello, everyone. I'm calling here from Ipsos Towers in central London. I'm actually in a room within the office, so out of both my windows, I can just see more office, but hoping others have a slightly more inspiring view than me. Are we waiting for any?
Hampshire, a lovely view from the garden, some beautiful autumn leaves.
Sounds much better.
And pet rabbits are much more exciting than our view. And lots of herring gulls. We've got Jenny from Lancashire watching autumn leaves. Fantastic. Great to see you all. Thank you for joining us. Wonderful. And the beautiful Devon countryside. How nice. I will pass over to you, Mike. I know you have some slides that you're going to be sharing. And so I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, I've already put them up, Ellie. Can you see them just to check?
Yes, great. I can.
Cool. All right. So hello, everyone. Thank you for listening. My name is Mike. I work at Ipsos. I was actually here virtually last year to talk a little bit about public attitudes towards the environment. And what I wanted to do this time is to give everyone a bit of an update on how things have progressed, because obviously last year we were at COP26. I think it was quite a big topic of conversation. And I think that the conversation has moved on a little bit since then. So I wanted to talk about, where are public attitudes at the moment and what might that mean going forwards. And the title I've chosen is the idea of balancing the long term with the short term, because I think there's as we know, quite a lot of pressures that we weren't thinking about last year facing people at the moment. And I think how we resolve that tension is something that's a really interesting conversation people are having, and something for us all to consider as the winter wears on. So very briefly, I think I'll just introduce the company, Ipsos. We're one of the country's largest market and social research agencies. We do work for government, for example, but also lots of private sector work for brands and so on. So I think we've got quite an interesting position where we look at things both from sort of citizen and consumer perspectives. And so our strapline overall is the idea of understanding society. And I think we do a lot of work on sustainability from a lot of different angles. And what I'm hoping to do here is to bring a selection of that together now to give that sort of fuller idea about, what people think about the environment, but also how they're acting and how that's influencing their choices, not only as citizens, as I said, but also as consumers of things day to day. So in my presentation today, I've got sort of three broad topic areas. The first one, talking about where public attitudes are in the environment today and how that's progressed since I last spoke to you last year. The second one, then I want to look at how that relates to the public's values. So there's slightly deeper held beliefs about the environment and about other topics, and where do we see tensions and alignments between those two areas. And then thirdly, where does the public see the balance of responsibility lying on taking action? So I think, we'll cover this, but I think people generally think there's a problem and that we ought to do something, but, what should we be doing and who should be doing it is the area we're in now in terms of where we see more fragmentation in public attitudes. And throughout, I've got a few pop quiz questions to make sure everyone's paying attention, getting you to think about and maybe reflecting on your own perceptions about where you think the public attitudes lie, and maybe exploring what you think about that as well. So the first section I wanted to go over is this sort of situation report. Where are public attitudes now? People meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh for COP27. What are people thinking? Where do they place emphasis at the moment? So, and I'll talk about this later as well. I think that the thing that it's important to think about is that everyone agrees essentially that we should be worried about climate change. So we've been asking this question about how concerned are you about climate change since 2005, actually, and probably earlier than that. And what we've seen is that now in 2022, 84% of people say they are either very or fairly concerned. And that's been steady since before the pandemic. So we've seen throughout the last couple of years a sustained level of concern with a slight dip last year, but still much higher than it was, say, in the early 2010s. What I think is interesting actually is that in the past it has been this high. So 2005, we see 82% of people concerned. So there has been a dip, but the level of concern amongst the public has increased again. Obviously, that's a warning that perhaps things can go in the same direction again. But at the moment, very much everyone's on the same page when it comes to agreeing that climate change or global warming is an issue that people should be worried about. However, and this is where I come to my first question, when we ask people unprompted, so we run a survey called the Issues Index, where our interviewers say, what do you think are the biggest issues facing Britain? And then stop and listen and hear what people say, and then write up those responses. So when we ask people that way around, and this is where we come to the first quiz question, Ellie or Loz, if you can help with this, I'm wondering if people can guess what proportion of Britons say climate change or the environment is a big issue for the country. So you should see 4 options here. And we'll give everyone a second to make their choice. Okay, so the results are in. We've got a fifth of people in this audience thinking it's 14%. We've got 40% saying it's slightly higher at 31%, and then some people going higher still. So about a quarter, it's getting confusing, saying a quarter of people think half of people are worried, and then even still some people say 68. Actually, the score is the lowest that we've seen here. So we are at 14% of people unprompted saying the issues around the environment are a big concern. So not the most commonly selected response in this audience. And I think it speaks a little bit to what people are seeing when they look out the window more generally at the moment. So this is the top 10 for the most recent Issues Index from October, and climate change is a top 5 concern, but it does just scrape in there. Actually, when we ask people what their biggest concerns are, unsurprisingly, perhaps at the top, we've got the economy, and then also inflation and prices. So public attitudes are really in a very economic, market-oriented perspective at the moment, which is perhaps unsurprising, with inflation again hitting a new record since the early 80s last month. But actually, concern about the economy overall and whether we're headed into a recession has jumped significantly. And those are the things we see dominating public concern. Underneath that, of course, there is the NHS, which, considering the extent of waiting lists we're seeing in England and in other nations, is perhaps actually quite low in the public priorities. And then this code we have for which we call lack of faith in politicians, which is all about people concerned about what's going on in government. And this poll was taken after Rishi Sunak was appointed, but the fact that it's still in the top 5 reflects some concerns over what people had seen over the last couple of months. And then we see climate change. So 14% of people, if you just grab them on the street and say, what do you think is the biggest issue facing Britain? 14% of people will say something about climate change and the environment. And that ranks up alongside other issues. We've got poverty and inequality, immigration, housing, education, and actually petrol prices as well, and not that far behind. So you've got that sort of opposite environmental concern code there. People worried about the price of fuel as well as being worried about the environment. And that means actually, when we look back at we've asked this question for a very long time, and here I've got it back to 2012. And if we reflect on where we were a year ago at COP26, when the environment was very much top of mind for everybody, we had 40% of people saying this is the biggest issue facing Britain. That was the highest. It made it the top issue, and was also the highest level we'd seen of concern about the environment since, I think, the late 80s. So since then, we've seen, with the war in Ukraine, inflation and so on, things drop quite significantly. So over that year, we've gone from 40% concerned to 14% concerned when it comes to that being that top of mind issue. Obviously, there are different ways to ask this question. If we provide people climate change as an option, as on a list, it tends to score a little bit higher. And I think that gets towards what I'll talk about later when we talk about values and what people see to be important. So when we rank and say, here's a list of things, to what extent have you worried about each of these over the last couple of weeks? Things go a little bit higher. So overall, you see about a third of people in Britain saying climate change is something they've worried about over the last couple of days. And that puts it about the same level with sort of war and terrorism, people being rude, growing old. So it's interesting to see it ranked amongst different options, things that personal concerns like growing old alongside concerns about society, such as COVID-19 or war or terrorism. And then we see actually what comes top here is people's health. So, not having enough money, issues about the environment still rank highly, but when you give people these options and get them to reflect on things that are a little bit more personal to themselves, that comes out top, and health is the top there. So in Britain, you've got sort of a third of people saying they worry a great deal or quite a bit in the last couple of weeks about climate change, and a quarter of people saying they don't worry at all. Actually, when we take a step back, because we asked this question amongst a range of different countries, Britain comes out relatively low. So you see that 34% at the bottom. That puts Britain sort of the bottom 5 in terms of intensity of concern about the environment. If you look to the top, we see countries in Latin America, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, Argentina, but also Italy. And I think that's quite an interesting comparison to draw the variation we see within Europe. 7 in 10 Italians say they've worried quite a lot about the environment in the last 2 to 3 weeks, compared with a third of Britons. And similarly, Germany, Australia, Japan, and Canada, that level of concern is slightly lower. But it still remains a relatively big issue, but you can see that concern is more in some countries, more than it is in Britain. Although when we look at sort of developed countries, so another poll here, we ask people, what do they think about the environment? Is it not a concern? Is it a concern, but that concern is largely overblown? If the environment is a risk, but there's still time to act, or whether the environment is at a critical stage and we have to act now. Britons kind of fit in with the global picture here. So about half of Britons think the environment's at a critical stage and the world has to act now. And they're slightly more likely to be a bit more sanguine about it. But what we get here is the idea that it's not necessarily the top of mind issue, but it is something that's seen as important. And I think that's sort of what we see across a lot of countries in the world at the moment, that probably where Britain is fairly accurately reflects a lot of settled opinion in Europe and also elsewhere around the world. Because obviously there has been a lot going on. I think this year, looking back, we're sort of the end of the year now, we're thinking about our wrap-ups, how we might summarize 2022. And actually there has been a hell of a lot of change, particularly compared with the last couple of years. There's been war in Ukraine, inflation has come out of nowhere and become a huge issue. And obviously Britain has seen quite a lot of political instability. We've had 3 prime ministers, including in Liz Truss, the one who's held office for the shortest time in the 300-year history of that post. We've had 4 chancellors. I shudder to think how many environment secretaries we've had. The turnover has been quite intense, and that has attracted a lot of attention. And you see that from the slide I showed earlier, that top of mind issues, there's a lot going on which is vying for concern about the environment. Similarly, though, some of those changes, some of those big stories we've seen have sharpened our attention. Obviously, I think we're still, despite the rain in South London and elsewhere, the country is still predominantly in drought. And that led us to do some polling up people's perceptions of temperatures. And we found 60% of people say temperatures now are warmer than when they were growing up. And that's the same across generations. Even young people say the same, which is quite an interesting finding. I think it's not just people who've been around for several decades thinking it's warmer. It's actually people in their 20s similarly likely to say that's the case. It also allowed us to ask quite a poppy question, I guess, for what people think is their perfect temperature. And this is where we come to the second quiz question for you all. I'm wondering if you can take a guess at what is the most commonly selected perfect temperature for Britons. You've got a range there now. When we ask people what's the perfect temperature for you, what do you think was the most common option? I'll give you a clue. It's not 41 degrees as this picture shows. On the left, this must be a thermometer from Lincolnshire earlier in the year. Okay, the results are in. What do we got? So the most common one, 22 degrees, and we've got a bit of a spread around that point. So it's like 18 is the least, 24, and then 20 degrees. The actual answer is 20 degrees. So we gave people a range of options, and 4 in 10 people say that their perfect temperature is a relatively cool, actually, I think, 20 degrees. And obviously, if you think about it, this sort of temperature might become slightly less common in summer over the next couple of decades. It's quite interesting to think about where people's perceptions of what a good temperature is, and the fact that things are now, in Lincolnshire, it was double this. In lots of the country, it was double this for one day. I think that's drawing attention in a way that it hasn't before. So it's quite interesting to have that point in mind, that Britain's idea of an ideal temperature is actually relatively cool compared with what we've been seeing. And I think actually this is we can see this being reflected in attitudes. So, when we have our intermittent very high temperatures, we do polling about, thinking about the recent hot weather in parts of the UK. To what extent do you think it's mainly caused by climate change as a result of human activity, mainly caused by natural processes, or a mix of both? And so when we look back to 2019, when we last had a significant heat wave, we had about 6 in 10 people saying it was a mix of both, a quarter saying it was mainly caused by climate change, and about 15% saying it was natural processes. This year, so when we look to 2022, you can see that balance beginning to shift quite a lot. Now we have roughly equal proportions saying it's either entirely or mainly human activity, 40%. So a jump of about 15% saying that the hot temperatures are a result mainly of human activity, and the proportion you say it's a mix is going down. So that's that message that hot temperatures are associated with climate change and human activity in particular is one that's being reinforced through the events we've seen this year. And that has resulted in some changes in behaviours. I'll get onto behaviours a bit more, because obviously those are much trickier to shift than people's opinions. But when we ask people thinking about energy usage, and this is the inflation, cost of living angle coming to the fore, how often are people doing the following actions to try to reduce their energy bills over the last 3 months? And the big movement you can see here is people not turning on the heating. So that cost element is still front of mind, but it is driving some behaviours that are more environmentally friendly. And this is a polling from October, so covering the 3 months prior, August, September, and most of October. Already you're seeing people not turning on the heating. You can only imagine what might happen over the coming months, particularly as we enter early next year. But there is some evidence of movement. Lots of the other ones here are staying pretty much where they are. Interestingly, we've not seen any increase in people going to the office to save to save money on their home electricity and gas, which I think was one theory people had. But there are some signs of movement in behaviour here. And that takes me on to the point that the environment remains an important value. So if we think about, I guess, deeper held views people have about who they are and what's important, I think we've seen the environment being ingrained, the need to be sustainable, increasingly being ingrained in the idea of what's an important value for people to have in Britain. And actually that's something where in Britain we've seen a lot of movement over time. So in our polling back to 2013, we asked this question of whether people think we're headed for an environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. And looking back to the start of the last decade, Britain lined up with Australia and the US, where this was a slightly more divisive issue. So you had 6 in 10 people agreeing, but obviously a significant minority not thinking it was the case. And actually, opinion in Britain was quite far from what you might consider the European mainstreams. Italy, France, and Germany, they were all around 8 in 10 at that point already. And over this decade, we've seen Britain move from being in that slightly more skeptical position to being in line with other countries in Europe. So there's been quite a shift. And I think people have seen that in politics and the way that this issue is debated. There's certainly the idea that we need to do something about the environment, and that's an important thing to do, is enter the value set. You can see actually this is our 2022 polling I've included here, so something which is just coming out. There's been a little bit of a drop from 2021, but still it's around 8 in 10. And actually also now Australia and the US, where these are still more divisive issues, they're getting closer towards that European level as well. So overall, the developing world is moving towards this environmental value. And Britain has probably seen the sharpest movement of the countries that I'm showing here. And in this very busy chart, we're also seeing lots of behavior changes as well. So this is asking people about the actions they might take in the next year in order to be more environmentally friendly. And we've asked this question since 2014, which I think is quite unusual and shows where we are actually starting to see some movement. So in terms of turning off lights, installing insulation, walking instead of driving, eating less meat, not flying, eating fewer dairy products. Since 2014, all of those areas we've seen people being much more likely to claim they're going to take these behaviors. And actually, when we look at comparison with 2021, so the most recent change, you see more, and actually in some of those areas, which might be more important around diet, so eating less meat, eating fewer dairy products, and actually a retention not flying. These behaviors, even more recently, are showing signs of shifting. So you can see, this is how we resolve people's values, which are increasingly green with their behaviors. It's beginning to catch up, although obviously it's slow. And even here, we're talking about likely reported behaviors, which are not the same as what people actually do. But regardless, clearly, even if it's just social desirability bias, the idea of being more environmentally friendly, including through making personal changes, is taking hold a little bit more than it has in recent years. But it's of course important to remember that attitudes remain fragmented. We've just released this environmental segmentation based on about 11 countries that breaks down the population into different groups. And I think it's quite an interesting way to approach this topic, because the normal reaction is to see a sort of a for and against block. You're either in favor of environmental movements or doing things like that, or you're not. But actually, it's much more complicated than that. So we have this sort of 5-part split in countries across most of Europe, I think, between the activists who are sort of most likely to compromise their lifestyle for the environment, think the world in the environment's at a critical stage, we must act, which is around 1 in 5 of the population. The idea then of pragmatists, those who are older, more affluent, worried about the environment, but likely to take action through low cost and home-oriented actions, and have some element of compromise on their lifestyle, but not as much as the activists. And those are probably the 2 groups where you see sort of the most sustained environmental perspectives. And then we have actually a majority of the population here who are much more conflicted. So the middle group, the conflicted contributors, whose financial situation takes precedence over their environmental concern, a significant group. And you can see this being an important group over this winter, because keeping them on side is the difference between having a majority of people in favor of taking environmental actions and not. Similarly, there's a group called busy bystanders, those who are effectively busy, they've got kids, they're employed, they've got a mortgage, they care about the environment, so to that point that everyone thinks it's an important thing to do something about, but they see lots of barriers to action on climate change. It's inconvenient, it's expensive, they've got bigger fish to fry. And again, that's a significant proportion of the population. So that sort of covers 8 in 10 of the people we've seen in lots of different countries. And then obviously you have a sort of disengaged denialist group for whom the environment isn't a concern, or it's not an immediate concern, or they think that it's not necessarily, concern is overblown. And these are the ones less likely to take environmental action. Obviously these people all exist, but I think it's not that there's just one group who are pro or one group who are against. Actually, it's very situational for a lot of people, that your hardcore activists are as a smaller group as the denialist group, and actually there's a very large middle group who need to be won over for different reasons in order to make behavior changes across society. I did look at this as well by the UK, and what this draws out is actually that middle group, that conflicted group is bigger in Britain than it is in lots of other countries. People, effectively those whose financial situation is more important to them than the environment, but still care about the environment. So again, as we think about the coming winter, that's quite an interesting group to have in mind when you're thinking about building support for environmental action. And finally, my third section, I want to talk a bit about views of government action 1 year on. What do people think the government's doing or not doing after COP26? Where do they think people should be taking action, and what do they think should come next? Which comes up to my third and final pub quiz question. What proportion of Britons say they're aware of the commitments countries made to tackle climate change at COP26? There was a lot of media coverage. There was a lot of news, and I think people paid attention in a way they hadn't to the environment whilst this event was on. But what proportion of people do we think say they know what was agreed? So you've got the options popping up now. Okay, the results are in. You've got such little faith in the British public. Maybe my last questions conditioned you all, But that's almost 3/4 of people think that just 9% say they're aware of the commitments that were made. And we've got 7 people who are more optimistic there, saying it's half. And actually, those 7 people are right. It is indeed 49% who say they're aware of the commitments countries made to tackle climate change at COP26. So it's sort of a mixed legacy here. About half of the population saying they're aware that commitments were made. I mean, if we were to start asking this 49%, what were those commitments? I don't know if necessarily they'd be able to tell you. But I think you can see here that we had a lot of cut through last year, and there is a lasting impression, but it's perhaps not as universal as we think, but clearly better than a lot of people in this group thought it would be. So hopefully that's a positive message you can take out. Of course, it's not all plain sailing. So when we ask a few more detailed questions, 39% of people say the UK government has a clear plan in place for how government, businesses and people are going to work together to tackle climate change. This is actually 10 percentage points higher than when we asked in Earth Day 2021. So again, there is an impact from COP26. It has pushed it up the agenda. It has increased the perception that the UK has a plan, but still for a lot of people, they're unclear on what the plan is, or they're not interested in what it is. So positive movement, but not necessarily as much as you might think. We see, again, quite a split on optimism. So half of people in Britain think it's likely the UK will have made significant progress in reducing climate change in the next 10 years. And I think, whether that's positive or negative, I think is an interesting question, but we're seeing that sort of a reasonably high level of cut through and actually quite a lot of optimism, although obviously 47% of people don't agree that the UK is going to make significant progress. But of course, reliably, we can expect people less positive about other countries. So it's under half there, almost half, but not quite say that it's likely that other countries will have made significant progress in reducing climate change. So it's reasonably encouraging that those two figures are quite close, because often you find people saying, oh, we'll do our bit, but no one else will. But here we see a bit more of a mixed picture. Perhaps people less optimistic about the UK, but maybe more optimistic about other countries than perhaps I was expecting. But clearly, there's still lots of space and work to do in terms of the fallout of COP26. And that's not to say the public don't want to go further and faster. When we ask people about UK government commitment to hitting net zero in 2050, when we asked in July 2019, over half of people said the UK should work faster on this, and about a quarter of people said that was the right target. Since then, we asked this question again in July, it's pretty much the same, but you can see, imagining what we've been through since 2019, the other priorities people have vying for attention, that long-term goal is still supported and still in place. You've still got over half of people saying the UK should be working more quickly on this. And that's probably a useful target for people to have in mind, to know that we're expecting more action, and people want to see things moving more quickly. And you have to remember that's in tension with perhaps the fact that people are worried about the finances or whether they're going to be able to heat their home over the next 6 months. But it's important to have that long-term goal and the public sort of perception that that's, 3/4 of people here think either 2050 is about right or it's not good enough. And relatively few think it should be more slow than that. It's probably an encouraging sign, and shows that sort of stability of values in terms of what's important, and the environment being one of the things that is important amongst the public mind. However, of course, when we get into the policy side of things, you begin to see a slightly different picture. And the idea that the carrot is definitely referred to the stick when you ask the British public about what policies they would support. So at the top here, you can see there's a lot of support for government spending on subsidies to make environmentally friendly technologies cheaper, on changing product pricing, in the way that you've seen with the sugar levy, perhaps, to make environmentally friendly products cheaper and the more damaging products more expensive. I'd be interested to see how that varies across different types of food, but there's a lot of public interest in that area as well. And then incentives for investing in green financial products and services. All three of these attract majority support in Britain as policies the government should pursue. When we look at less than half, though, you can see that the harder decisions are still less supported. So 42% agree you should be increasing taxes on more environmentally damaging travel. 37% say we should be giving more road space to pedestrians and cyclists at the expense of motorists. I think the most important one to bear in mind here is right at the bottom, that just 3 in 10 Britons support the idea of higher taxes on non-renewable energy sources such as gas and oil. And obviously in a time where gas prices, oil prices are going up quite a lot, it's clear that that's a sore point for the public. And you can look back to France and the Gilets jaunes movement, that this is a hot topic issue for lots of people. The idea of making non-renewables more expensive is probably less popular than making renewables cheaper. And that sort of positive orientation is quite important to bear in mind for policymakers and for communications as well. I did, as a cyclist myself, I did want to call out the level of hostility there is probably towards giving cyclists more space in Britain. So this is the detail on different countries of giving more road space to pedestrians and cyclists at the expense of motorists, which I think is an interesting trade-off question. Living in London, you've seen a lot of this, roads being thinned and lanes being lost in order to give more cycle space. But Britain is amongst the countries least in favour of this as a policy, and actually is relatively evenly balanced there. You see 37% support and actually 35% oppose. And you can compare that to the Netherlands, where half of people say that even more space should be given to cyclists and pedestrians at the expense of motorists, and just that 1 in 5 disagree. It's clear that policy in particular is quite one which arouses strong opinions. It will probably come as no surprise most people to hear this in Britain, and one which is more divisive than lots of others. And we've seen this in low traffic neighborhoods and so on. There's a lot of issues when it comes to road space in Britain particularly. And so when it comes to whose responsibility is it to inform and educate the public, so when we start thinking about action, we ask this question across a range of different countries, and actually Britons stand out as being more likely to see the government having responsibility in this area. So 7 in 10 Britons say it's the government's responsibility, it's elected politicians' responsibility to inform and educate the public about what they need to do to fight climate change. And actually also, despite much vaunted distrust of the media, the public are more likely to see the media as being important here, and also more likely to see scientists as having a role, which again, I think is quite interesting. We do lots of polling on trust in different figures, and we've seen a big increase in trust in scientists over the last couple of decades. So they're an interesting, coming out of COVID as well, I think they're an interesting group that the British public are looking to for news and information on how they can inform and educate themselves about what to do next. There are actually some which are less popular as well amongst Britons, which I've drawn some attention to, I think. Environmental campaigners and activist groups is probably the most interesting one. Obviously, across our sample here, this group is less likely to be seen as one who has a responsibility to inform and educate. Just 19% across our global sample, 34 countries, say this group has responsibility here. But in Britain, it's even lower still, almost half. So 12% of people saying environmental campaigners and activist groups should have a responsibility here. We also see lower for local governments, which I think reflects sort of the centralized nature of British politics. And that's quite a lot lower than lots of other countries, so 33% versus 43%, and also maybe a smaller role for schools than other countries see as well, so 18% versus 24% saying schools have a responsibility here. So there's quite a focus on sort of national government, national media, and scientists' voices of expertise, and slightly less on local governments, campaigners and activists, and schools to be telling people how they can live in a more environmentally friendly way. We also asked a question about government sectors of industry, which I think is actually really interesting, because obviously we can talk about government, but where do Britons think different specific business sectors have responsibility for reducing their emissions? The blue is the global figures, and the green is the British ones. And obviously there's a lot of agreement here. Energy companies, energy providers are seen as having the most responsibility to reduce their carbon emissions, followed by car makers and public transport. So there's a clear link in the public mind to, they provide me with gas, they drive cars, they create cars. People see that link very clearly. Towards the end, actually, people are less likely to make that link, particularly on financial services and online retail. But actually, this is where I think Britons stand out a bit from the global picture, and that they see there's more responsibility for these sectors to reduce their climate emissions. I think online retail is obviously really interesting. When people think about online retail, they think about Amazon, they think about other companies that will mail you things. I think they're not thinking about the enormous logistic operation that sits behind online retail. If we were to say logistics companies, they'd probably appear somewhere far towards the left. There's an interesting perception gap here about what people think online retail is and what they think its carbon footprint is versus what its footprint is when you take into account their full operations when it comes to delivery and so on. And similarly, financial services, people don't tend to associate that with climate, but not only through their operations, but also through their investments, financial services do have an outsized role to play. It's an interesting difference here, but I think Britain's more likely to see lots of different business sectors outside of the usual suspects of energy companies, car makers, and airlines have a responsibility to reduce their carbon emissions here. So that will be my presentation. I just want to sort of finish off with a short summary and then maybe break for some questions in the time we have left. So first, and back to my point about values, I suppose the public agree we need to do something about climate. 8 in 10 or more say they're worried about climate change. We see lots of people saying that we really ought to be doing something about it. But there are a lot of other immediate factors right now battling for attention. People's concern about their health and concern about their wealth are things which feel much more immediate and require much more immediate action in the minds of lots of people, thinking particularly about that conflicted contributors group, which is bigger in Britain than it is in lots of other countries. But as I said, fighting climate change is an important value for many. And I think where the public need help from the government and also from others is how they can connect up their short-term needs, the needs to have enough money to pay for the heating, to get through this winter and to survive inflation, with that much longer-term picture of hitting net zero in 2050 or even sooner. There's a big tension there between what the public want. They want two very different things that might not connect up very well. So helping people to make that link is really important, I think, now and going into 2023. And despite the low priority that we see top of mind and the fact that there's a bit of a mixed picture when it comes to prioritization from the public, there are some encouraging signs of movement in terms of people's behaviors or their reported behaviors. And I think seeing how those develop over the next couple of years will be quite interesting to see how far people's values and the importance they see in fighting climate change wins out over whatever new shocks and disruptions we will see over this winter and into next year. So I'll end there and just say thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mike. We've had lots of questions come through in the chat, so we'll try and get through as many of them as we can. Also, Livy mentioned in the chat if that report is public and has it been published yet?
Which report, sorry?
Or the statistics that you were going through.
Basically, everything I've gone through is public. It's not necessarily conveniently in a single location, but I can share some links and so on that can go out later on if that's okay, Ellie.
Brilliant, thank you. Would you be able to share your slides at all?
Yeah, I should be able to share the slides as well. I can share those too.
Fantastic. We can send that out at the end of the conference. So we're going to be gathering links and sending them to delegates and recordings as well. And we can share those slides as part of those resources. Thanks, Mike. That's brilliant.
No worries.
We had a few questions in the chat about our kind of first poll question. So what proportion of Britons say climate change is a big issue for the country unprompted? And there was a few questions about what was meant by unprompted.
Okay.
So was that looking at public discourse in natural conversation and how that was gathered?
Sure. No, absolutely. I think it's hopefully a relatively simple. I'm using my survey language, which isn't always that helpful for people, but essentially our interviewers ask people, what do you think are the biggest issues facing Britain? And then they just listen to what people say. And what they have is a list of issues that they don't show to people and they tick things off. So I think what that does is it gives you a measure of what's really top of mind right now. And that's what I mean. So at the moment, climate change is less of a top of mind issue. If you ask someone, what's worrying you at the moment, they're less likely to say that than they are to say, oh, it's the economy or inflation or the NHS. So unprompted just means, we're not giving people a list. We're not giving them an option to select it. Because if you give people a list of 15, you'll probably see a higher proportion because people can see it. But the idea is with that question that you don't show people anything, and therefore you get a much quicker read of literally what's top of mind when you're asking the question. Hopefully that makes sense. Brilliant, thank you.
There were a few questions as well about demographics and if there's how inclusive are the demographics of the respondents?
Oh, okay. So in terms of, well, everything, I guess.
I think so. There was one specific question about age, actually.
Okay, age.
And with regards to that first question about kind of unprompted responses, whether there's knowledge of if we know those 40% are similar age to one another.
Okay. Yeah. So really testing me now. I think at 14, yeah, it will be relatively even. I think, in all of our polling, I think there's a really interesting debate around, old people, young people, who's the most environmental. I think it sort of relates to that point that almost everyone's worried. So I think in that unprompted poll, there isn't much differentiation by age between, the youngest people and the oldest people we spoke to. It's all sort of broadly the same. And when you look at some of the other questions as well, there tends to be less differentiation by age. I think the idea that the environment is a problem is something that's accepted by people of all ages. I think the really interesting question, and you saw that in the segmentation and some of the other things that we've brought out, is that what we think we should do about it and the trade-offs we're willing to make do vary a lot more by age. So I think that's where you might see a little bit of a difference. So we asked a question about whether people feel guilty about their impact on the environment, and actually you see quite a strong age break there, with younger people more likely to say they feel guilty about their impact on the environment than older people. And so you can sort of read that into perhaps younger people are more likely to support more radical actions. That's something you see not just in the environment but in policies all over the place. Young people more in favor of ripping up the status quo than older people, and I think we see that pattern in the environment too. So that top line, if you ask who's worried, I don't think you'll see much difference. But if you then say, well, what are you going to do about it? That's where you begin to see a little bit more differences, particularly by age, I would say.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a question from Kate in the Q&A as well. So has there been any research into what influences people's environmental attitudes and how this might have changed over time? She's given some examples in there as well. So she asked if, they asked if they're influenced by media coverage, NGOs, social media, peers, etc. If you have any knowledge of that.
So I think media is always important. Obviously, what we mean by media varies a lot by age and varies over time as well. I think, when I showed that chart of 40% of people saying the environment was an issue last November, that was driven by political attention, that was driven by media attention on the COP26 event and the news coverage out of it. So I'd say when you ask people top of mind, often it's going to be what stories they saw most recently. And I think then you do see media driving it. In the longer term, actually, I think it's quite interesting. In that code I've shown, it's sort of evolved over time. So back in the 90s, it was effectively a bad weather code. So if there were flooding, if there was a drought, you'd see a spike. But since 2012, actually, it's continued to rise more steadily and independently of droughts or storms or hurricanes, which I think tells you that it's become a lot more about concern about the environment rather than, oh, isn't it wet today? So there's been quite a different evolution, both of those driven by media. The coverage of storms and droughts is often highlighted by the media, but I think sort of the content of that concern has become much more environmental over the last decade and less tied to weather as well, which I think is an interesting evolution that we've seen.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we've got time for one final question. I might pose, one might be slightly challenging. Okay. Apologies to everyone. I'm ready. And completely understand if you don't have an answer. Richard's asked how we might be able to extrapolate surveys that ask questions about climate change to ecological change, whether there's much commonality there between those questions or answers.
That's really, yeah, I've always, the triple challenge idea. Obviously, a lot of the attention in the polling world and in the political world is on carbon emissions, but obviously biodiversity and those sorts of things is also really important. I think maybe a year or so ago, we did ask, there was a survey about, how worried are you about the climate change and how worried about nature, the state of nature in your country. And I think, which is testing me, in Britain, actually, there's quite a big difference with people being more likely to say they're concerned about climate change and less likely to say they're worried about the state of nature. In some countries, that's different. From memory, I think in Italy, they're both very high. I think that's right, that there is that sort of that focus on carbon is quite strong in Britain, and perhaps there is a lot more space when it comes to concern about biodiversity and ecological topics, which I think are a little bit compartmentalized. We haven't done anything recently on that, so obviously the data I'm thinking about is probably from 2019 or 2020. I think that's a really good question. I think there probably is a gulf there in terms of what people are worried about and the extent to which they're worried about ecological issues.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much, Mike. I'm aware of the time, so I'm afraid we have to wrap up there. There's been so many. Yeah, exactly. And we are going to stop for lunch now, but from 12 o'clock, there will be some networking sessions that people can join and chat with other delegates, just open sessions. But thank you so much, Mike. That's been so interesting. And thank you, everyone, for contributing as well in the chat and in the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening.